Reports collected from the scattered remains of ancient archives, fragmented records preserved in long-buried data vaults, and the remnants of oral traditions describe a power that rose across the Pacific Basin during the latter stages of Old Earth's Age of Strife. Historians of the Administratum, aided by limited material surveys carried out under Mechanicus oversight, have pieced together an image of a vast, centralized dominion that claimed sovereignty over immense stretches of Asia and the Pacific Rim. Its name has come down in records as the Pan-Pacific Empire, though its own citizens are unlikely to have used such a standardized term. The available evidence is fractured. Earthquakes, floods, and nuclear detonations erased much of the archaeological record. Even so, repeated surveys of the drowned coastlines of Indonesia, the Philippine archipelagos, and the shattered remains of the Chinese interior provide confirmation that large-scale civilizational structures once existed there. Megacities have been located beneath tectonic rifts, revealing foundations of materials engineered to withstand pressures far beyond natural geological limits. Within these structures are inscriptions that indicate a standardized imperial language, and the recurring sigil of an angular sun rising from ocean waves has been recovered from multiple sites. These symbols appear consistent across widely separated ruins, implying centralized governance and deliberate cultural propagation. Eyewitness accounts that survived into later centuries paint the empire as a society characterized by militarization and authoritarian control. Many of these testimonies were preserved in conquered populations elsewhere during the Unification Wars, particularly among Indonesic bloc captives and scattered Australian survivors. While some sources contain embellishments and mythologized accounts, they are consistent in portraying the Pan-Pacific state as technologically advanced compared to its neighbours, with a capacity to maintain strict regulation of both its citizenry and its conquered peoples. The Empire's rise was shaped by necessity. The Age of Strife on Earth was an era dominated by violent warp storms, psychic upheaval, and the collapse of ancient techno-structures inherited from the Dark Age of technology. Where many human societies disintegrated into tribal confederations or feudal warlords, the Pacific Basin's populations consolidated. Vast stretches of land were devastated by tectonic instability and rising seas, and resource competition forced political leaders into centralized authority. The resulting structure was both militarized and pragmatic, designed to survive scarcity while projecting strength outward. Records suggest the Pan-Pacific Empire controlled populations numbering in the hundreds of millions. Estimates drawn from surviving census fragments and administrator models indicate that at its height, the empire may have maintained direct governance over at least 200 million individuals, with extended influence reaching further into surrounding territories. These populations were diverse, incorporating East Asian, Southeast Asian, and Oceanic lineages. The empire enforced a unifying identity through language, standardized education, and mandatory service. While regional distinctions were not entirely erased, official policy was aimed at creating an imperial citizen first and a local identity second. The average subject of the empire was conditioned from birth to contribute to the collective survival of the state. Physical descriptions gathered from surviving genetic records suggest an emphasis on physical fitness, endurance, and adaptability to humid coastal climates. Average male height across surveyed remains appears to have ranged between 170 and 175 centimeters, while female averages fell between 160 and 165 centimeters. Skeletal analysis indicates a generally lean but resilient physiology, likely the result of both genetic selection and environmental hardship. Civilian life within the Pan-Pacific Dominion appears to have been stratified yet functional. Most citizens were bound into agricultural, industrial, or military service, depending on aptitude and state necessity. Agricultural work relied heavily on engineered crops adapted to brackish water, with rice and seaweed-derived products forming the dietary foundation. Protein was supplemented through aquaculture, particularly engineered fish species bred to thrive in controlled ocean pens. Industrial production focused on durable alloys and atmospheric filtration technologies, reflecting both the polluted environment of the period and the Empire's desire to sustain large urban populations. Military service was omnipresent. Archaeological discoveries reveal that nearly 1/3 of the population underwent formalized paramilitary training. The Empire employed a conscription system that rotated civilian populations into basic service during adolescence, followed by periodic retraining in adulthood. This practice ensured that even the general populace retained a familiarity with weapons, formation tactics, and survival drills. Among elite ranks, professional soldiers formed the backbone of expeditionary forces and internal security. Culturally, the Empire valued discipline and unity over individuality. Surviving inscriptions speak to a collective destiny, a rhetoric that emphasized the endurance of the Empire against a hostile world. Citizen records describe mottos engraved into public buildings. The ocean binds us, discipline is survival, and the Empire endures. Such phrases point toward a unifying ideology, not of religious transcendence but of pragmatic collectivism. Scholars of the Administratum have speculated that these cultural traits allowed the Empire to project control over such wide territories without immediate collapse. The Pan-Pacific Empire existed as both a civilian society and a military organism. For its citizens, daily life blended routine labor with the constant awareness of the Empire's militarized presence. For its rulers, survival meant constant vigilance against both natural disaster and rival polities. These traits, forged in hardship, would shape the Empire's later role in the Wars of Unification, where it stood as one of the Emperor's most formidable adversaries. The study of the Pan-Pacific Empire's food culture offers a revealing window into both its survival strategies and its collective identity. Unlike many other polities of the Age of Strife, which descended into famine-driven collapse, the Pan-Pacific state engineered a sustainable, if austere, nutritional economy. Agricultural remains suggest that rice was not merely cultivated, but systematically modified to resist salinity and irregular flooding. These modified strains, recovered from fossilized seed banks along what was once the Mekong Delta, contain genetic markers inconsistent with natural evolution, suggesting deliberate bioengineering by imperial technologists. Rice, therefore, was not only a staple food, but a demonstration of state-directed innovation, designed to feed large populations under hostile environmental conditions. Complementing this grain-based diet was the cultivation of seaweed and algae in vast offshore farms. Oceanographic surveys of the Pacific Basin have identified drowned superstructures consistent with artificial reef systems, arranged in geometric patterns and constructed with resilient alloys. These installations likely served dual functions, stabilizing coastlines against erosion while providing anchorage for algal cultivation. Algae were processed into nutritional supplements and fuel sources, forming a critical part of both civilian diets and the Empire's industrial base. Archaeologists have also uncovered preserved ceramic containers, once holding a paste of mixed algae and ground fish meal, a common ration for soldiers and workers alike. Protein intake was sustained through aquaculture. Fish pens and enclosed oceanic domes allowed the breeding of species resistant to changing ocean temperatures and high levels of pollution. Genetic analysis of skeletal remains reveals modifications in gill structure, confirming that these fish were artificially altered for survivability. Citizens consumed fish as their primary source of protein, while the upper castes enjoyed rarer meats, such as fowl and swine, raised within controlled biohabitats. Some evidence suggests that synthetic protein was also available, likely distributed through nutrient blocks designed to sustain frontline troops. Culinary culture, though utilitarian, retained regional diversity within the Empire. Records from conquered communities reveal traces of spice trade and fermentation practices carried into the imperial fold. Soy-based products, fermented vegetables, and fish sauces endured as cultural staples, though their preparation was standardized and rationed by state authorities. Public mess halls distributed meals to civilians in regimented intervals, reinforcing the Empire's ethos of collectivism. Food was not a matter of individual preference, but of survival and unity, a resource carefully measured and collectively consumed. Early technological integration was equally critical to the Pan-Pacific Empire's endurance. While the Age of Strife stripped humanity of much of its Dark Age inheritance, the Empire retained fragments of high technology and developed hybrid innovations adapted to scarcity. Energy production relied on a combination of geothermal tapping, wave-based generators, and compact nuclear systems. Subterranean ruins beneath the Japanese archipelago reveal geothermal conduits routed through urban heating grids, while drowned coastal sites show remnants of tidal energy plants. These systems were integrated into citywide networks, providing a stable energy foundation for both civilian populations and military industry. The Empire also placed significant emphasis on cybernetic augmentation and biomodification, though on a smaller scale than the mechanicum of Mars or later Imperial structures. Fragmentary medical texts describe controlled enhancement programs that reinforced soldier endurance, increased tolerance to radiation, and accelerated recovery from injuries. Surviving skeletal remains with metallic grafts and ceramic bone reinforcement suggest the Empire experimented with permanent physical integration of technology into its troops. These modifications were rarely distributed among civilians, but elite military units were granted access, ensuring the Empire retained a cadre of hardened, augmented soldiers to project its authority. Communication systems within the Empire reveal an understanding of data preservation and centralization. Administratum scholars analyzing preserved transmission nodes conclude that the Empire maintained a region-wide information grid, likely using ocean floor cables and atmospheric relays to coordinate its territories. Encryption systems, though degraded, suggest an emphasis on secure transmission between urban centers and military command nodes. This infrastructure enabled the rapid mobilization of forces and strict regulation of civilian life, a hallmark of imperial governance. Environmental adaptations were perhaps the defining feature of the Pan-Pacific Dominion. The Pacific basin of the Age of Strife was marked by rising seas, violent typhoons, and tectonic instability. Entire regions that once hosted thriving civilizations were swallowed by ocean waters or shattered by earthquakes. Yet instead of retreating inland, the Pan-Pacific Empire adapted itself to maritime survival. Coastal megacities were engineered on reinforced foundations, with lower levels designed to withstand flooding. Archaeological surveys show layers of sealed bulkheads and water-pumping systems capable of clearing submerged districts, evidence of an empire unwilling to surrender its coastal heartlands. Floating platforms and artificial islands extended the empire's habitable zones. Constructed of composite alloys, some of which resist corrosion even today, these platforms supported both agricultural facilities and military outposts. They functioned as mobile colonies, tethered to anchor points or allowed to drift strategically within controlled waters. Such engineering provided resilience against environmental collapse while expanding territorial claims across the Pacific expanse. Inland regions were adapted for survival as well. Mountain basins were converted into terraced agriculture, supported by irrigation systems that recycled both rainfall and glacier runoff. Urban settlements constructed in these regions used reinforced walls to resist landslides and quakes. Entire districts were built within hollowed mountainsides, where subterranean living protected populations from storms and surface instability. This dual approach, maritime adaptation and subterranean refuge, allowed the empire to sustain its populations even as much of old Earth crumbled around them. The adaptability of the Pan-Pacific Empire was not purely physical but cultural. Citizens were indoctrinated to see environmental hardship as part of the empire's destiny. Floods, quakes, and storms were not regarded as signs of decline but as trials to be endured collectively. Propaganda inscriptions recorded on surviving mural fragments described the ocean not as an enemy but as a crucible that forged unity. This cultural acceptance of environmental hardship became a key strength during the later wars of unification, when other polities faltered under ecological collapse while the Pan-Pacific state endured. Taken together, the empire's food economy, technological integration, and environmental resilience formed a triad of survival. Citizens were fed by engineered agriculture, sustained by hybrid technologies, and sheltered by adaptive engineering. These qualities allowed the Pan-Pacific Empire to grow into one of the most powerful and enduring states of the Age of Strife, capable of resisting rivals and standing as a formidable obstacle to the Emperor's eventual unification. The technological foundation of the Pan-Pacific Empire was neither as advanced as the remnants of Dark Age constructs, nor as degraded as the tribal warbands scattered across Old Earth during the Age of Strife. Instead, it represented a hybrid state, fragments of earlier high technologies, preserved and adapted into functional systems, combined with innovations born of necessity. This combination produced a technological profile that was not uniform but adaptive, tailored to the immediate survival needs of the Empire while still allowing for military projection. The Empire's energy infrastructure reveals this hybrid character most clearly. Geothermal systems beneath volcanic zones in the Japanese archipelago, wave-based turbines along the Pacific Rim, and compact fission reactors scattered throughout subterranean complexes all contributed to a reliable energy base. Although many of these installations showed signs of degraded efficiency, they nonetheless enabled the operation of urban life, industrial manufacture, and military production. The Empire maintained redundancy across these systems, ensuring no single failure would cripple its capacity. This adaptability distinguished it from neighbouring powers that often relied on single, decaying power plants or makeshift generators. Weaponry was a central priority of Pan-Pacific engineering. Archaeological recovery teams of the Adeptus Mechanicus have documented energy weapons with condensed plasma containment chambers, though on a scale less efficient than those of the Dark Age. These weapons were primarily reserved for elite units, while standard infantry relied on chemically propelled firearms. Unlike the crude scavenged rifles found in surrounding polities, Pan-Pacific firearms demonstrated precision manufacturing, consistent ammunition calibers, and reinforced alloys designed to withstand humidity and corrosion. Rifles with composite stocks and ceramic-lined barrels have been discovered in coastal ruins, their design reflecting the Empire's ability to mass-produce uniform, reliable arms. Sidearms included compact machine pistols distributed to officers and mechanized infantry, while heavy machine guns mounted on stabilized bipods provided suppressive fire. Archaeological fragments of electromagnetic rail-assisted rifles suggest that the Empire experimented with kinetic acceleration technology, though these appear to have been costly prototypes rather than widespread equipment. The Empire also deployed chemical agents and flame-based weaponry for both urban suppression and battlefield shock tactics. Evidence of incendiary gel canisters has been uncovered in war-scorched ruins, indicating the Empire's use of controlled immolation against fortified positions. Personal gear was standardized across the population. Soldiers of the Pan-Pacific legions wore composite armor constructed from layered ceramics and flexible polymers. This armor provided resilience against small arms fire, shrapnel, and environmental hazards such as acid rain and radiation exposure. Helmets incorporated filtration masks and limited visual enhancement systems. Though not equivalent to the advanced autosenses of later millennia, these helmets extended survivability in toxic or storm-ridden environments. Civil defense units drawn from conscripted populations were issued lighter armor, consisting of reinforced textiles layered with protective plating at vital zones. Tools and auxiliary equipment reveal an emphasis on both industrial utility and field adaptability. Multi-purpose cutting devices, powered by portable energy cells, functioned as both construction instruments and battlefield breaching tools. Portable generators and atmospheric scrubbers allowed units to operate in collapsed urban zones where air quality was compromised. Engineering Corps carried modular toolkits capable of maintaining both vehicles and defensive structures, reflecting the Empire's focus on rapid adaptability. These toolkits were distributed widely, suggesting that even non-specialist units were trained to perform emergency maintenance in the field. Vehicles of the Pan-Pacific Empire combined rugged endurance with partial technological sophistication. The Empire fielded armoured carriers constructed of composite alloys, capable of traversing both coastal plains and flooded terrain. Amphibious capability was a standard requirement, reflecting the geography of the Empire's dominion. These carriers transported infantry across fragmented landscapes, ensuring mobility even when infrastructure was destroyed by storms or warfare. Battle tanks were also employed, though with a focus on reliability rather than cutting-edge technology. Recovered chassis fragments indicate tracked vehicles equipped with large-caliber cannons and reinforced frontal armour. Secondary weapons included mounted machine guns and, in rare cases, short-range energy projectors. These tanks were not equivalent to the super-heavy constructs of the Dark Age or the later Imperium, but nonetheless provided battlefield superiority against tribal militias and less organised states. Naval power was a defining aspect of the Empire's military. Command of the Pacific required fleets capable of both projection and defence. Archaeological surveys have discovered remains of heavily armoured ships along submerged coastlines, constructed with alloys resistant to corrosion. These vessels appear to have carried missile systems, rotary cannons, and troop deployment bays. Submersible craft were also employed, used both for reconnaissance and covert insertion of troops. The Empire's control of maritime trade routes and oceanic choke points allowed it to maintain economic and military dominance across its sphere of influence. Air vehicles were present in the form of tilt-rotor craft and atmospheric jets. These provided rapid troop deployment, reconnaissance, and close air support. While limited in number compared to the scale of the Empire's ground forces, they played a key role in asserting dominance over fragmented rivals, many of whom lacked any equivalent aerial capability. Social structure within the Pan-Pacific Empire reflected the militarized nature of the state. At the base level were the civilian populations engaged in agriculture, aquaculture, and industrial labor. These citizens were bound by strict quotas and schedules, overseen by local administrators who reported directly to imperial command structures. Above them were the trained conscripts and militia units, who alternated between civilian labor and military service. This dual role reinforced the sense of unity between survival and defense, binding the Empire's society to the constant presence of militarization. Professional soldiers formed the next stratum, serving as the permanent military apparatus of the state. These units received enhanced training, better equipment, and often rudimentary augmentations. Officers emerged from this caste chosen both for loyalty and ability, though political reliability often outweighed tactical brilliance. Beyond them stood the technocrats and engineers who managed the Empire's hybrid technologies, maintained its infrastructure, and developed innovations that allowed adaptation to environmental collapse. At the apex of the Empire was a centralized leadership often described in records as an emperor or hegemon. Accounts differ on whether this figure was a single hereditary monarch, a succession of dynasts, or a title bestowed upon the strongest leader of the time. Surviving fragments suggest a dynastic structure, with succession secured through both bloodline and military support. The hegemon was supported by an inner council composed of generals, engineers, and administrators, who together coordinated the governance of the empire. The values of the empire were forged through hardship. Discipline, collectivism, and endurance were emphasized at every level of society. Individual freedoms were curtailed in favor of communal survival. Citizens were expected to sacrifice personal ambition for the continuation of the state. Propaganda emphasized unity against external and environmental threats, portraying the empire as humanity's bastion in a collapsing world. Dissent was not tolerated, with evidence of internal security forces enforcing ideological conformity. Yet, within this rigid system, citizens found purpose and stability, qualities absent from many surrounding societies of the Age of Strife. Education reinforced these values, instilling loyalty to the empire and familiarizing children with both civic and military responsibilities. Training in survival skills, weapon handling, and technological maintenance began early, ensuring a citizenry prepared to adapt to sudden crises. The fusion of civic and martial life became so complete that distinctions between soldier and civilian blurred. To live within the empire was to serve it, either through labor, combat, or both. This integration of technology, military readiness, and ideological discipline allowed the Pan-Pacific Empire to endure when so many others fell. Its weapons and vehicles provided superiority over rivals, its tools and infrastructure ensured survival, and its social structure transformed its population into a unified instrument of state power. These traits would later define its role as a formidable adversary during the Wars of Unification, when even the Emperor of Mankind found resistance worthy of prolonged campaigns. The historical record of the Pan-Pacific Empire is fragmentary, yet certain names and units emerge consistently across administratum compilations, mechanicus data excavations, and the oral traditions of conquered populations. These figures and formations illustrate the militarized essence of the state and reveal how the empire projected its power during the latter Age of Strife. Among the most frequently cited leaders is the figure known as the Sea Emperor, or alternately the Oceanic Hegemon. Surviving inscriptions and recovered propaganda tablets place this figure at the apex of imperial power during the empire's zenith. Scholars remain divided over whether the Sea Emperor was a single monarch, a dynastic title passed through successive generations, or an ideological construct designed to unify the population. What is certain is that this figure embodied the empire's identity, commanding fleets, directing armies, and appearing in ritualized imagery as a human form rising above waves. Captives taken during the Wars of Unification later recalled the Sea Emperor as a ruler whose word was law, whose decrees extended from the mountains of East Asia to the drowned islands of the Pacific. Beneath the hegemon operated a cadre of generals and admirals, many of whose names have been lost, yet a handful survive, preserved in local traditions that resisted erasure even after imperial conquest. One such figure is General Kylo, credited in oral accounts with orchestrating the empire's inland campaigns into Central Asia. His strategies emphasized overwhelming mobility and the use of combined arms to break tribal confederations. Another, Admiral Nantai, is associated with the empire's maritime dominance, commanding fleets that secured the empire's hold over shipping routes and fisheries across the Pacific basin. These individuals, though obscured by myth and propaganda, represent the military genius that allowed the empire to maintain its reach. The empire's military units were similarly legendary. Records refer to the Tideborne legions, infantry formations drawn from coastal populations and trained extensively in amphibious warfare. These legions specialized in rapid assaults launched from sea to land, exploiting their ability to traverse flooded terrain and storm-battered coastlines. The Tideborne became synonymous with imperial expansion, their disciplined ranks striking fear into neighboring polities that lacked comparable training. Another renowned formation was the Iron Current, a mechanized division equipped with amphibious carriers and armored tanks. These units functioned as the hammer of the empire, capable of breaking entrenched defenses and sustaining momentum across hostile terrain. Surviving chassis fragments of their vehicles reveal heavy reinforcement and the ability to operate for extended periods without resupply, suggesting an emphasis on durability over speed. Oral accounts describe the Iron Current as relentless, advancing through storms, quakes, and hostile fire with unshakable persistence. The Empire's war machines reflected its technological pragmatism. Unlike the super-heavy constructs of the Dark Age or the towering god engines of the Mechanicum, Pan-Pacific designs were compact, functional, and suited to their environment. Amphibious tanks armed with large-caliber cannons formed the backbone of their armored divisions. Some sources describe towering walkers with jointed legs, designed to traverse swampy terrain and shallow seas, though only scattered fragments of their plating have been recovered. Naval vessels, particularly the Empire's armoured cruisers, represented its greatest war machines. These ships combined missile systems, rotary cannons, and troop deployment bays, functioning as both mobile fortresses and staging platforms for amphibious operations. Behavioural tendencies within the Empire's forces reveal a culture of discipline, resilience, and collective identity. Soldiers were trained to suppress individual instinct in favour of coordinated action. Oral accounts from defeated rivals describe Pan-Pacific troops advancing in disciplined formations even under heavy fire, their cohesion unbroken by casualties. This unity was not the product of blind obedience but of systemic indoctrination from childhood, reinforced by years of collective survival against environmental catastrophe. Fear was both acknowledged and suppressed. Training regimens exposed recruits to simulated floods, chemical exposure, and starvation conditions, ensuring that soldiers confronted terror in controlled environments before facing it in reality. This conditioning produced troops who endured hardships that would have broken less prepared forces. Their instinct was not to flee or scatter, but to regroup, reform, and continue fighting. Rituals played an important role in maintaining this cohesion. Soldiers engaged in daily oath-taking ceremonies, swearing allegiance to the Empire, the Sea Emperor, and their unit. Prior to battle, units participated in synchronized chants or rhythmic movements designed to instill unity and suppress fear. Archaeological finds of engraved tablets suggest that even civilians took part in ritualized affirmations, repeating slogans such as "discipline is survival" and "the ocean binds us." These practices reinforced the ideological framework that sustained the Empire's discipline. Ethical frameworks within the Empire were pragmatic rather than idealistic. Survival and unity were paramount. Morality was defined by what preserved the state. Citizens were expected to sacrifice personal needs for the collective, and disobedience was treated as betrayal. At the same time, loyalty was rewarded with stability, food security, and protection. This ethic created a society in which citizens accepted harsh regulation because it offered continuity in a collapsing world. Internal divisions existed despite the Empire's emphasis on unity. A caste structure underpinned its social order. At the base were labourers and agricultural workers who sustained the Empire's population through their toil. Above them stood conscripts, who bridged the gap between civilian and soldier. Professional soldiers occupied a higher status, their loyalty and discipline rewarded with privileges such as superior rations and augmented housing. Technocrats and engineers formed a separate caste, their knowledge indispensable for maintaining the Empire's hybrid technologies. They were granted authority and autonomy, though always under the oversight of the central leadership. Internal security forces, functioning as both enforcers and political overseers, formed another distinct stratum, ensuring ideological conformity across the Empire. At the top stood the ruling caste centered on the hegemon and the inner council. This leadership exercised control through a combination of fear, propaganda, and demonstrated stability. Succession disputes occasionally fractured this ruling circle, but the Empire's rigid structures ensured continuity of governance even in times of internal conflict. The caste system was reinforced through education, propaganda, and ritual. Citizens were taught to see their place in the hierarchy as essential to the survival of all. Advancement was possible but rare, usually through exceptional military service or technical achievement. This limited mobility reinforced discipline, discouraging rebellion while allowing the state to reward loyalty selectively. The Pan-Pacific Empire's leaders, units, war machines, and social structures combined into a formidable system of survival and dominance. Its armies were disciplined, its society unified through ritual and ideology, and its leadership centralized yet pragmatic. Behavioral conditioning ensured soldiers who endured hardships, while internal divisions provided functional order without undermining collective identity. These traits made the Empire one of the most powerful states of the Age of Strife, and one of the most difficult adversaries faced during the Emperor's Wars of Unification. The earliest accessible records compiled by the Adeptus Administratum concerning the Pan-Pacific Empire reflect an attempt to categorize the civilization, not in terms of its own myth-making, but through measurable statistics and logistical assessment. The Administratum archivists, writing in the centuries following the Unification Wars, often struggled with consistency, given the fractured state of surviving records and the deliberate obfuscations left by the victors. Even so, their observations provide a detached picture of an empire that had grown out of a pre-imperial order, one marked by consolidation of resources, strict centralization of military power, and an unusually high investment in bioengineering. When collated into quantitative reports, the administratum identified several trends that differentiated the Pan-Pacific Empire from other human blocs of old Earth. The first was demographic density. Populations under its dominion were not merely large but intensely concentrated, packed into urbanized coastal zones and reclaimed land masses. Island chains, once regarded as uninhabitable, were rendered into dense settlements through engineering projects that combined artificial platforms with reinforced seabed supports. This concentration of human life created immense logistical challenges. Agricultural land was limited, forcing the empire into a model of vertical farming and controlled hydroponic complexes. Administratum records note the consistent production of algae-derived protein blocks cultivated in vast processing vats that line the coasts. The high reliance on such synthetic nutrition was remarked upon with particular interest, as it had both improved food stability and imposed a uniformity on the diet of the people. The Mechanicus observers, often working in parallel, evaluated the same phenomenon with greater attention to the machinery. They regarded the Pan-Pacific Empire as one of the few human powers in the Age of Strife to have achieved stable integration between human population growth and automated support systems. The Mechanicus analyses highlight the utilization of early mass propagation factories, capable of producing both nutrient matter and mechanical components with minimal external inputs. Recycling chains were near closed loop, with every form of waste broken down into reprocessable materials. To the Mechanicus, this represented a proto-industrial model that approximated the autarky later idealized within the Forge worlds. However, they also noted that the Empire's engineering was insufficiently modular, relying on centralized megastructures that were difficult to relocate or reproduce elsewhere. From a logistical standpoint, the Administratum calculated that the Empire's food stability allowed it to support military campaigns far longer than its rivals. Distribution networks were organized through regimented quotas, enforced by caste officials who monitored consumption. Rationing was both commonplace and culturally normalized, to the degree that feast or famine had less social meaning compared to other blocs. The uniform provision of food, however limited in variety, ensured that armies of the Pan-Pacific Empire could march with predictable supply chains, unhindered by the variable harvests that weakened other factions. This predictability extended to labor as well. Mechanicus reports emphasize the precision of labor allocation within the Empire. The integration of early computational tools allowed leadership to predict population requirements across agriculture, military, and manufacturing. Census data, updated with remarkable accuracy, ensured that draft quotas were met without severe disruptions to industrial output. The Administratum regarded this as a critical factor behind the Empire's military sustainability. In contrast to polities that collapsed under the strain of mass mobilization, the Pan-Pacific Empire balanced war production with civilian survival, though at the cost of significant freedoms. On the subject of leadership, the Administratum noted that the Pan-Pacific Empire was centralized under a single dynastic rule, often referred to in records as the Gene Lords. These figures combined political authority with a symbolic claim of biological superiority. Reports emphasized their use of genetic enhancement, both genuine and exaggerated, as a legitimizing factor. From the perspective of the Administratum, this was a pragmatic tool of statecraft, rather than a genuine spiritual distinction. Gene Lords were described as the nodes of command within a highly stratified hierarchy, their orders carried through multiple echelons of military governors and civil overseers. Mechanicus records corroborate these accounts, but focus more heavily on the bioengineering that underpinned these rulers. They observed that the ruling class likely underwent augmentation, not dissimilar in methodology to the Proto-Astartes projects later attempted by the Emperor. The evidence points to a regime that valued heritable traits engineered for stature, strength, and endurance. The Mechanicus regarded such practices as crude but effective, an attempt to establish continuity of governance through literal genetic inheritance. While such methods lacked the sophistication of imperial gene seed manipulation, they served to maintain a visible distinction between the rulers and the ruled. Logistical breakdowns prepared by the administratum reveal further divisions within Pan-Pacific society. At the base level existed the labouring masses, concentrated in urban settlements and bound to agricultural or industrial quotas. Above them were the steward castes, a managerial class responsible for distribution, monitoring and enforcement of production. These stewards acted as the connective tissue of the empire, relaying commands downward and resources upward. The military class, larger than in most contemporary blocks, functioned both as enforcers and as external aggressors. Their ranks were sustained not merely by conscription, but by a culture that idealized martial service as both a duty and a privilege. The administratum analysis compared this layered society to a biological organism. The labourers functioned as the digestive system, converting resources into usable material. The stewards acted as the nervous system, transferring information and directives. The military was the muscular structure, enabling expansion and defence. At the core, the gene lords embodied the brain, centralised and autocratic. This biological analogy was meant to explain the systemic stability of the Pan-Pacific Empire, which endured longer than most rival blocs in an era of chaos. Mechanicus evaluations were more critical of the Empire's technological approach. While they acknowledged the early development of closed-loop systems and mass fabrication, they noted the Empire's failure to preserve adaptability. Their vehicles, for instance, were engineered for naval dominance and coastal defence, heavily armoured but cumbersome. While such craft were well suited to the archipelagic geography, they struggled to adapt to continental campaigns. Weapons favoured by the Empire, including energy-based projectors and chemically accelerated firearms, were advanced for the period but often over-engineered, requiring maintenance that exceeded the capacity of field troops. The Mechanicus judged this as symptomatic of a culture that equated technological impressiveness with practical efficacy. Administratum records cross-reference these observations by noting that despite their maintenance burdens, the weapons of the Pan-Pacific Empire instilled fear among its adversaries. Plasma-derivative arms, though unstable, were deployed on a wider scale than in other blocks. Infantry carried weapons capable of cutting through standard armour, and armoured suits provided by the Empire were regarded as precursors to powered exoskeletons. The frequency of equipment failure did not negate the psychological dominance such tools achieved in battle. Armies faced with the Empire often encountered war machines they had never seen before, undermining morale before contact was even made. The administratum also emphasized the scale of the Empire's war production. Factories constructed along coasts and within island strongholds operated continuously, producing war material at a pace that exceeded rivals. When calculated in terms of units per annum, the Pan-Pacific Empire outproduced the Indonesic bloc by an estimated factor of 3 during its peak. This industrial capacity was one of the chief reasons it maintained dominance over wide regions despite resistance. However, these calculations also reveal the eventual weakness of the Empire. Its industry was bound to fixed coastal nodes. Once these were disrupted during the Unification Wars, production collapsed with little redundancy elsewhere. Mechanicus reports treat this collapse as a case study in over-centralization. They noted that the Empire's inability to replicate its industrial nodes inland or in orbit left it vulnerable. Attempts to engineer artificial island bases during its decline were seen as desperate measures that lacked sufficient resources. The Empire's technological prowess, while real, had been too narrowly applied to environments it could control. When it encountered an adversary with broader adaptability, such as the forces of the Emperor, it could not sustain its infrastructure under prolonged assault. The administratum concluded that the values of the Pan-Pacific Empire were rooted in a balance between collectivism and authoritarian direction. Individuals were subsumed into quotas, production schedules, and military service, yet this was accepted as necessary for the survival of the whole. Records suggest that loyalty was less a matter of ideological conviction and more a result of systemic conditioning. From birth, citizens were integrated into systems that tracked their productivity, nutrition, and health. In return, they were provided stability in an era where most human communities endured famine, warlordism, and collapse. To the administratum, this made the Pan-Pacific Empire unusually resilient. Its people did not revolt in large numbers, not because of devotion to the Gene Lords, but because the system functioned with a ruthless efficiency that offered predictability in uncertain times. This predictability was a resource more valuable than freedom. It allowed the Empire to marshal armies, supply them reliably, and maintain internal order with minimal expenditure of force. Mechanicus assessments mirrored this conclusion, but extended it into the realm of technological philosophy. They considered the Pan-Pacific Empire a case where early human polities attempted to merge governance and machine into a seamless system. The Empire's monitoring networks, census machines, and distribution hubs were proto-cogitators, precursors to the more advanced data engines of the Mechanicum. The Mechanicus did not venerate this system, but they acknowledged its effectiveness. They also noted the dangers of such integration. Once the system was damaged, the entire social body began to fail, lacking redundancy or organic flexibility. Together, the impressions of the Administratum and Mechanicus present the Pan-Pacific Empire as a civilization both advanced and brittle. It excelled in sustaining large populations, feeding them through controlled production, and equipping armies with frightening weaponry. It faltered, however, in the rigidity of its structures and the over-reliance on centralized nodes. For the Administratum, this was a lesson in the importance of logistical resilience. For the Mechanicus, it was a case study in the dangers of overconfidence in engineered perfection. Both perspectives converged on a final analysis. The Pan-Pacific Empire was a formidable power within the Age of Strife, but it was ultimately ill-prepared to contend with a unifying force whose adaptability, technological superiority, and vision for Terra surpassed its own. The Administratum's records of the Pan-Pacific Empire's wars are fragmentary, but nonetheless extensive enough to draw certain patterns. The Age of Strife created a fractured world where competing polities waged campaigns for resources, legitimacy, and survival. The Pan-Pacific Empire, situated across a wide expanse of the Pacific and its rim territories, entered these conflicts with the confidence of a centralized state that had marshaled immense manpower and industrial capacity. Its battles were not isolated events but sustained campaigns of attrition and dominance, designed to enforce obedience and prevent rival blocs from threatening its borders. The first category of conflicts consistently mentioned in Administratum archives are the wars of consolidation across the Pacific Basin. These were fought against smaller coastal polities, city-states, and maritime coalitions that resisted absorption into the empire. Mechanicus analysts later described these campaigns as testing grounds for the Empire's naval and amphibious doctrines. Naval supremacy was regarded as a cornerstone of the Empire's strategy, and its fleets were constructed not merely to transport troops but to act as mobile fortresses. Carriers deployed swarms of strike craft and drone-like submersibles that attacked enemy vessels and coastal defences in tandem. Administratum battlefield reports indicate that land assaults were often preceded by days of saturation bombardment from sea and air, reducing defences before amphibious troops made landfall. The fighting style of the Pan-Pacific Empire emphasized overwhelming pressure rather than maneuver warfare. Infantry advances were coordinated in dense formations, each soldier equipped with standard-issue armor suits that provided protection against small arms and environmental hazards. These armored troops, combined with energy projectors and projectile weapons of high caliber, created a line of advance that was difficult to halt once it had begun. Administratum records describe these troops as human walls, a term used to denote both their cohesion and their method of advance. Casualty figures, however, reveal that this style came at a high cost. Battles often expended tens of thousands of soldiers for relatively modest territorial gains, but the Empire could afford such losses due to its immense population reserves. One significant conflict preserved in records is the confrontation with the Indonesic bloc, one of the largest and most technologically distinct rivals of the era. This war stretched across multiple decades, with intermittent truces punctuated by sudden escalations. The Indonesic bloc's mastery of psionic integration created a unique challenge. Administratum notes emphasize that Pan-Pacific soldiers frequently displayed signs of psychological strain when exposed to the psychic warfare tactics of the bloc. To counter this, the Empire invested heavily in both material shielding and psychological conditioning, developing helmets and armor with embedded disruptors designed to lessen the effect of psychic intrusion. The fighting style that emerged from these confrontations was increasingly rigid and mechanical. Infantry formations moved in lockstep, maintaining discipline under psychic pressure. Officers were instructed to rotate troops rapidly to minimize mental collapse, a technique that taxed logistical systems but ensured continuity in the front lines. The Empire's fleets, meanwhile, adapted to block tactics by focusing on shock assaults. Mechanicus evaluations highlight the deployment of energy-dense weaponry, including plasma-derivative cannons mounted on capital ships, designed to obliterate enemy concentrations before psionic tactics could destabilize morale. Another notable theatre was the campaign against the South American techno-clans, whose guerrilla strategies contrasted sharply with the Empire's rigid discipline. Administratum accounts show that Pan-Pacific forces struggled in environments where their heavy armor and dense formations could not maneuver effectively. Rainforests and mountainous terrain negated the advantages of their exoskeleton suits, and attritional losses mounted as smaller, mobile enemies ambushed supply convoys and command centers. To adapt, the Empire began deploying specialized units with lighter equipment and reconnaissance tools, though these were limited in number. The Mechanicus later interpreted this as an indication of the Empire's difficulty in innovating outside of its established doctrine. Perhaps the most decisive campaigns recorded, however, were those fought directly against the forces of the Emperor during the final stages of the Unification Wars. These confrontations are only partially preserved, as Imperial historiography often minimized the significance of the Empire in comparison to later adversaries. Still, the fragments retained by Administratum scholars depict battles of immense scale. Coastal fortresses that had once served as symbols of the Empire's stability were besieged by forces that combined genetic super soldiers, advanced mechanized divisions, and orbital support. The Pan-Pacific Empire deployed its largest war machines in these engagements, massive amphibious walkers and floating citadels bristling with weaponry. Administratum reports estimate that some of these machines required entire factory districts to construct and could take years to complete. Their destruction marked not only tactical defeats, but strategic collapses, as the loss of each war machine crippled local morale and production capacity. The fighting style of the Pan-Pacific Empire in these late battles displayed both resilience and predictability. Their infantry maintained cohesion even under the devastating assaults of the Thunder Warriors. Their naval forces fought with determination, sinking Imperial transports and damaging war machines even as their own losses mounted. But their rigidity became a liability. The Emperor's forces exploited their reliance on fortified coastal positions, bypassing them through rapid aerial insertions and overwhelming force concentration. Where the Empire moved in predictable waves, the Imperial armies maneuvered fluidly, isolating and dismantling enemy units before they could reform. Mechanicus observers later emphasized the technological contrasts evident in these battles. The Empire's weapons, though fearsome, required constant maintenance and often failed when deployed in large numbers under combat stress. Plasma derivatives overheated, exoskeletons malfunctioned in humid or corrosive environments, and naval fortresses struggled to counter orbital bombardments. In contrast, Imperial technology, while in many cases less flamboyant, proved more reliable and adaptable. The Mechanicus concluded that this technological imbalance was a decisive factor in the Empire's downfall, as its military apparatus was unable to sustain prolonged campaigns once its industrial nodes were targeted. Administratum analysis of battle reports also emphasized casualty ratios. In direct engagements, the Pan-Pacific Empire often inflicted heavy losses, particularly against conventional human adversaries. Against Imperial forces, however, the ratio reversed dramatically. Entire regiments were destroyed in days, their rigid formations offering little resistance against superhuman soldiers. Supply chains, once considered unbreakable, collapsed when targeted by aerial and orbital strikes. The Empire's reliance on centralized logistics left little room for improvisation once those networks were disrupted. One particularly noted battle was the fall of the Tokyo megafortress, a coastal stronghold that symbolized the Empire's technological dominance. Administratum records describe days of bombardment, followed by amphibious assaults and massed infantry waves, each repelled at terrible cost. When Imperial forces finally breached the fortress walls, the defenders fought with unwavering discipline, engaging in room-to-room combat until they were annihilated. The Mechanicus account of this battle highlights the destruction of several experimental war machines within the fortress, including a rumoured submersible capital craft that never achieved operational status. The loss of these projects represented the final collapse of the Empire's technological edge. Throughout all of these conflicts, the fighting style of the Pan-Pacific Empire remained consistent: overwhelming pressure, rigid cohesion, and reliance on heavily equipped infantry supported by naval dominance. Its strengths lay in its ability to bring immense firepower and manpower to bear, sustaining campaigns long after others would have collapsed from exhaustion. Its weaknesses lay in its inflexibility, its inability to adapt to unconventional or superior opponents, and its over-reliance on centralized production and logistics. Administratum conclusions portray the Empire's wars as a testament to the strength of organization and industrial power, but also as a warning of overconfidence. The Mechanicus, meanwhile, preserved these records as case studies in technological determinism. They viewed the Empire's fate as proof that advanced machines alone could not secure victory without adaptability and redundancy. Together, these accounts provide a portrait of a civilization that fought with remarkable ferocity and discipline, yet was ultimately undone by the very rigidity that had once ensured its survival. The record of wars fought by the Pan-Pacific Empire does not end with its better-known struggles against the Indonesic bloc or the climactic confrontations with the Emperor's armies. Administratum vaults contain scattered references to a number of lesser campaigns, each of which illustrates the extent of the Empire's reach and the persistence of its martial culture. These include conflicts across the Indian Ocean Rim, punitive raids into Central Asia, and attempts to enforce tribute from fragmented polities in Australasia. One preserved account describes a series of campaigns waged against the remnants of the Pan-Asiatic collectives, polities that had fractured during the Age of Strife. These remnants relied on cavalry and fast-moving land vehicles, exploiting the open steppes to avoid direct confrontation. The Pan-Pacific Empire responded with mass deployments of heavy mechanized infantry, moving in rigid lines across the plains. Administratum reports note that these battles were protracted, with the Empire suffering disproportionately high losses to guerrilla raids. Mechanicus records identify that the Empire eventually introduced automated hunter drones equipped with energy weapons, an innovation that restored battlefield control but at significant cost. While successful in breaking the resistance, the campaigns drained resources that might otherwise have been applied to coastal defences during the later stages of the Unification Wars. Another set of conflicts occurred in the Philippine archipelagos, where separatist city-states resisted integration. These polities relied on swift naval craft and intimate knowledge of local waterways, frustrating the Empire's larger fleets. Battles became exercises in attrition, with small skirmishes fought daily along narrow straits and mangrove coasts. Mechanicus assessments emphasize that the Empire resorted to constructing vast artificial harbours and supply hubs to sustain prolonged operations in the region. While these eventually secured control, they highlighted the Empire's dependence on monumental engineering projects to compensate for environmental disadvantages. The Administratum also catalogues punitive wars launched against the Australasian enclaves. These enclaves had largely avoided the central conflicts of the Age of Strife, but their refusal to acknowledge the Gene Lord's supremacy drew the Empire's hostility. Administratum accounts describe a series of rapid amphibious assaults in which Imperial forces overwhelmed defenders with sheer numbers. Resistance was short-lived, but Mechanicus notes point out that the terrain proved ill-suited for long-term occupation. Supply lines stretched thin, forcing the Empire to abandon many garrisons within decades. These campaigns exemplify the Empire's willingness to overextend its reach in pursuit of symbolic dominance rather than sustainable control. The most decisive additional battles, however, remain those fought in the final stages of the Unification Wars. After suffering defeats in major coastal fortresses, the Empire attempted to regroup inland, constructing artificial redoubts in reclaimed territory. These redoubts were designed as last bastions, heavily fortified and supplied with stockpiles intended to last for years. Administratum records detail sieges that stretched for months, in which defenders fought with characteristic discipline despite dwindling supplies. In many cases, they continued to resist even after the Gene Lords themselves had been killed or captured. The Empire's survival instinct manifested in these desperate stands, a reflection of its long-cultivated ethos of collective sacrifice. Yet these redoubts were doomed. Imperial forces employed combined arms tactics, integrating orbital bombardment with genetically enhanced shock troops. Once key supply caches were destroyed, the defenders had no capacity to rebuild. Mechanicus reports observe that even the Empire's greatest fortresses lacked redundancy in power and fabrication systems. A single breach or power failure cascaded into systemic collapse. In the end, the redoubts became tombs, their defenders fighting to the last with no hope of relief. The aftermath of these conflicts was devastating to the population once integrated into the Empire. Administratum records suggest that entire urban regions, once dependent on the Empire's centralized infrastructure, collapsed into famine and disease following the destruction of supply chains. Hydroponic complexes, protein vats, and recycling plants required skilled maintenance teams that were wiped out during the wars. In some cases, cities that once housed millions dwindled to scattered bands of survivors within a single generation. Mechanicus evaluators confirmed that the Empire's technological base was too specialized to be adopted by smaller successor communities. Without the Empire's centralized command and resources, most of its machinery fell silent. The Administratum's analysis of the aftermath emphasized the scale of depopulation. Census estimates suggest that the territories once under the Pan-Pacific Empire lost as much as half their population within 50 years of its fall. Refugees fled inland, seeking subsistence in regions less reliant on the Empire's artificial systems. Those who remained often reverted to subsistence economies, scavenging materials from the ruins of once mighty fortresses. The Empire's legacy, from an administratum perspective, was therefore not merely its wars but the destabilization that followed, a disruption that erased centuries of development in a matter of decades. The Mechanicus framed the aftermath differently. They regarded the fall of the Pan-Pacific Empire as a cautionary tale concerning the fragility of over-engineered systems. The Empire had achieved a remarkable level of technological integration, with recycling loops, automated factories, and population monitoring that approached the later ideals of Forge World autarky. But its lack of adaptability proved fatal. When the Emperor's forces dismantled the central hubs, no decentralized infrastructure remained to sustain the population. The Mechanicus thus judged the Empire's legacy as proof that technology, no matter how advanced, could not endure without redundancy and modularity. Both perspectives converged in the final analysis. The Administratum emphasized the Empire's ability to wage sustained campaigns and its extraordinary logistical precision, while also noting the catastrophic consequences of its collapse. The Mechanicus acknowledged the sophistication of its early engineering but criticized its rigidity and failure to evolve beyond environmental limitations. Together, they portrayed the Pan-Pacific Empire as a civilization that reached for dominance through discipline and technological ambition, but whose very strengths became weaknesses in the face of a unifying adversary. The Empire's downfall was not sudden, but the result of cumulative structural flaws exposed under pressure. Its armies fought with unmatched cohesion, its fleets ruled the seas, and its war machines inspired fear. Yet when confronted with a foe that combined adaptability, superior genetic engineering, and orbital supremacy, the Empire's rigid doctrines crumbled. The aftermath ensured that little of its culture or machinery survived intact, save as fragments recorded by later historians and Mechanicus observers. For the Adeptus Administratum, the Pan-Pacific Empire remains a case study in the importance of balance between centralization and resilience. For the Adeptus Mechanicus, it serves as a reminder that technological ambition must be tempered by adaptability and modularity. To both, it illustrates the fate of a power that, for all its discipline and might, could not survive the test of the Unification Wars. When the Inquisition turned its attention to the records of the Pan-Pacific Empire, the tone of the surviving analyses shifted from the bureaucratic precision of the Administratum and the technical assessments of the Mechanicus to something more cautious and unsettling. The fragments studied did not simply describe a disciplined maritime empire crushed during the Unification Wars, but a society that seemed to have mastered methods and practices that did not fully align with the level of knowledge expected of a fragmented Terran state. Inquisitorial archivists noted repeatedly that certain aspects of the Empire's endurance remained unexplained, and in some cases deliberately concealed by earlier scribes. Among the most striking observations were the reports of population resilience despite catastrophic losses in war. Administratum estimates suggested that entire cities should have collapsed into famine within months after their hydroponic networks or protein vats were destroyed, yet eyewitness accounts from the Emperor's armies described Pan-Pacific civilians surviving in significant numbers long after infrastructure had been annihilated. The Inquisition considered the possibility that undisclosed survival protocols or biological augmentations had been introduced into the general population. Such theories remain classified, though scattered references to engineered dietary supplements and genetic hardening have appeared in sealed transcripts. Battlefield examinations uncovered further anomalies. Corpses of Pan-Pacific soldiers, preserved in saltwater bogs and permafrost, revealed bone densities and muscular structures that deviated from baseline human physiology. While the Mechanicus had dismissed some of these as the results of malnutrition or selective breeding, inquisitorial investigators suggested a more deliberate program of enhancement, perhaps administered through chemical or nutritional regimens rather than invasive surgery. No direct evidence of a full gene seed program has ever been confirmed, but the persistence of these anomalies led to concerns that the Empire may have approached a primitive form of controlled human modification. The Inquisition also noted inconsistencies in weapon remains recovered from coastal fortresses. Energy scoring on defensive walls implied the use of directed energy devices not accounted for in Mechanicus catalogues of the Empire's arsenal. Fragments of crystalline capacitors, fused into slag by bombardments, have been retained in sealed vaults and defy precise replication even with modern understanding. While it is possible these represented scavenged relics of old night, the frequency with which they appear across separate sites suggests either indigenous production or access to forgotten caches of standard template material. Such findings remain under strict prohibition for wider circulation, with the Ordo Reductor flagging them as material hazards. Equally troubling to inquisitorial observers were the cultural fragments left behind in the Empire's rituals and governance. Several accounts describe ceremonies in which soldiers submitted to prolonged sensory deprivation or controlled drowning before deployment, rites that appear to have induced altered states of awareness. While these may have been purely psychological conditioning, some records suggest measurable changes in reaction time and cohesion during battle. The possibility that such practices accessed cognitive pathways not fully understood today has drawn continued interest, particularly from Ordo Xenos specialists wary of parallels to later psychic indoctrination techniques. The greatest puzzle, however, lay not in what was found, but in what was absent. Entire regions once firmly under Pan-Pacific control appear devoid of material remains. Excavations reveal empty strata where habitation should exist, as though cities and fortresses had been deliberately dismantled or relocated. Inquisitorial theories range from systematic scuttling operations designed to deny the enemy resources, to the possibility of more unorthodox phenomena, such as temporal displacement or mass relocation of populations. None of these explanations has been substantiated, yet the absence itself is treated as evidence of intentional obfuscation. The Empire may have wished its traces to vanish in anticipation of defeat, leaving little behind for conquerors to claim or study. In reviewing these findings, the Inquisition concluded that the Pan-Pacific Empire cannot be regarded merely as another casualty of the Unification Wars. Its organizational discipline and military resilience were evident, but what disturbed later investigators were the layers of secrecy and the persistence of unexplained technologies and practices. While the Emperor's conquest erased the political entity, fragments of its methods may have survived in ways not yet fully accounted for. For this reason, the Pan-Pacific Empire remains a subject of restricted study, cited in inquisitorial archives as a case where the past resists straightforward explanation, and where the line between human adaptation and forbidden knowledge is uncomfortably blurred. The surviving accounts of Pan-Pacific battles preserved within inquisitorial archives reveal patterns that strain conventional explanation. Administratum scribes had long catalogued the Empire's efficiency in naval warfare and siege operations, yet scattered testimony from warriors of the Emperor's armies describes encounters that do not align with the mechanical precision otherwise associated with the Gene Lord's dominion. These accounts, often classified and sealed shortly after collection, suggest the presence of battlefield phenomena that have not been fully reconciled with the known technologies of the era. The first category of anomalies concerns the resilience of Pan-Pacific defensive bastions. Reports indicate fortresses that withstood sustained bombardment from gene-forged artillery and orbital strikes, only to collapse suddenly without visible breach. Siege engineers of the Emperor's host recorded instances in which walls fused into glassy ruin, as if destabilized by an internal energy surge. No functional devices capable of producing such effects were ever recovered. The Mechanicus speculated that the Empire employed concealed failsafe systems designed to destroy fortifications rather than allow capture, but inquisitorial reviews found this explanation insufficient. Witnesses consistently described a sense of unnatural silence in the moments before collapse, a sensory detail that cannot be explained by structural engineering alone. Another series of reports describes sudden disappearances of entire military units during retreats through dense jungle terrain in Southeast Asia. Pursuing forces noted that enemy soldiers seemed to dissolve into mist, leaving behind only discarded weapons and broken communications devices. Standard explanations of ambushes or hidden tunnels were proposed, yet the absence of tracks, bodies, or secondary engagements remains troubling. Later, Mechanicus excavations in the same regions discovered vast subterranean caverns, some artificially expanded but with no evidence of habitation or human remains. The possibility that these voids served as emergency evacuation sites has been raised, though why no traces of population remained has never been clarified. There are also records of anomalous battlefield behaviours observed in Pan-Pacific soldiers. Testimonies describe warriors continuing to fight after sustaining injuries that should have been fatal, displaying reaction times beyond expected human capacity, and moving in near-perfect synchronization without visible signals. Some inquisitorial commentators considered this evidence of psychic coordination, though others warned against attributing such behavior to phenomena not confirmed in later centuries. A sealed file maintained within Order Hereticus vaults mentions ritualized pre-battle practices in which units were exposed to chemical vapors believed to alter neural function. These substances have never been recovered, but the possibility that they induced collective trance states remains under quiet review. More obscure still are the accounts of naval engagements in which Pan-Pacific vessels were observed vanishing from auger readings and reappearing at unexpected vectors minutes later. The accuracy of these reports is disputed, with Mechanicus archivists arguing that interference from ionized storm systems distorted sensors. Nevertheless, multiple logs preserved from different fleets describe the same phenomenon, ships materializing behind pursuers in formations too precise to be coincidental. While there is no verified evidence that the Empire had access to warp-based technology, the repetition of these testimonies suggests either a sophisticated masking system or something more esoteric. Inquisitorial caution has ensured these records remain sealed, flagged under the possibility of early experimentation with forbidden transit methods. The Inquisition has also preserved accounts of encounters between Pan-Pacific commanders and emissaries of the Emperor, in which negotiations were attempted before full-scale war resumed. Several transcripts, heavily redacted, record references to the Gene Lords insisting upon their divine ancestry and the possession of knowledge that predated the Age of Strife. One commander reportedly offered to exchange fragments of ancient records in return for recognition of autonomy. The negotiations collapsed, but the suggestion that the Empire preserved written or encoded material from earlier epochs cannot be dismissed. No such documents were ever recovered in the aftermath of conquest, and their absence has been cited as evidence that they were destroyed deliberately, rather than risk falling into Imperial hands. Perhaps the most disquieting anomaly concerns the final months of resistance, when Imperial armies pressed deep into the Empire's heartlands. Soldiers reported facing defenders who bore facial markings and scarification patterns unknown in earlier phases of the war. Some bore symbols resembling concentric circles, others carried brands etched with metallic pigments that gleamed even under dim light. The function of these markings remains uncertain. Some witnesses claimed they conferred a strange aura of intimidation, describing feelings of nausea and disorientation when confronting the marked warriors. The Inquisition has treated these reports with particular caution, for while they may represent psychological warfare or the effects of chemical agents, they could also indicate flirtations with proto-rituals of a more dangerous nature. In reviewing the sealed reports, the Inquisition concluded that anomalies in the Pan-Pacific campaigns could not be explained solely through conventional technologies or battlefield stratagems. The Empire had access to methods of endurance, coordination, and concealment that do not align cleanly with the technological or cultural baselines of the period. Whether these arose from fragments of ancient human science, suppressed proto-psionic practices, or simply the remarkable discipline of a society honed by endless conflict remains uncertain. For this reason, the records remain compartmentalized, with dissemination limited to those tasked with studying the darker thresholds of human history. Under the authority of the Ordo Historicus, and in cooperation with sealed archives accessible only to select inquisitorial designates, a body of material exists concerning the Pan-Pacific consolidation that has never entered the wider scholastic record. These files reflect a careful gathering of testimony, fragmentary records, and intelligence drawn from data crypts long thought, erased during the consolidation of Terra. The conclusion is not one of clarity but of absence. What can be established with certainty is consistently interrupted by deliberate excisions, damaged accounts, and patterns of omission. This has led some archivists to assert that the greatest truth of the Pan-Pacific regime lies not in its governance or wars, but in what has been removed from official knowledge. The files speak of an unusual density of bio-experimental programs undertaken under the auspices of Pan-Pacific authorities. Whether these were the work of state-sanctioned scientists or clandestine cells remains contested. Survivors' testimonies collected much later describe zones in which human subjects were subjected to forced modification, with the stated goal of achieving endurance in extreme environments. In nearly every case, the records end abruptly, replaced with redacted notes signed under symbols resembling those later used by proto-custodian authorities. This suggests interference at a level above the Pan-Pacific leadership, though the dating leaves many questions unanswered. Other classified holdings detail the suppression of vast religious movements within the Pan-Pacific domain. The zealotry of these movements is curiously described as both destructive and highly adaptive, with breakaway cults reappearing even after entire populations were reported as eliminated. Certain reports describe figures whose descriptions border on impossible, individuals manifesting knowledge of events centuries in the future, or uttering prophecies later fulfilled in ways too specific to dismiss as coincidence. All such testimonies were marked with notations recommending their permanent sealing, with some bearing the signature of proto-administratum clerks operating under imperial mandate well before the formal unification. Anomalies in the terrain of Pan-Pacific battlefields also appear throughout these documents. Inspectors sent long after the wars discovered radiation readings, energy distortions, and material residues inconsistent with the weaponry known to have been deployed. Though explained officially as atmospheric or tectonic disturbances, the margins of the files contain annotations raising suspicions that entirely unknown forms of armament may have been tested. In some cases, the presence of these distortions continued for centuries, resisting all efforts at reclamation. Marginalia written by later inquisitorial analysts speculate that these were not pan-Pacific creations at all, but interventions by powers either outside of human origin or connected to warlords who operated far beyond public knowledge. What emerges from these sealed documents is less a portrait of a simple empire defeated by the advance of unification, and more a fragmented glimpse of a society whose reach into biological, religious, and technological domains exceeded what the official histories would suggest. The final notes from inquisitorial reviewers stress caution in drawing definitive conclusions. They acknowledge that the Pan-Pacific legacy cannot be cleanly disentangled from the later rise of imperial authority, and that attempts to do so are hindered by the deliberate burial of facts. Some go as far as to conclude that the emperor himself had reason to obscure the truth, not merely for political necessity, but to prevent recognition of forces that might destabilize the narrative of inevitable unification. The closing remarks of the highest clearance files end on an observation both unsettling and unresolved. If even a fraction of the anomalies attributed to Pan-Pacific science, cultic persistence, and battlefield distortions are genuine, then the Empire's true significance was not as an obstacle to unification, but as a proving ground where deeper conflicts played out beneath the surface of recorded history. In this, the Pan-Pacific Empire may not have been erased solely for what it was, but for what it revealed, and for the dangerous persistence of knowledge that the Imperium has never ceased to suppress.